Welcome! Today's presentation is designed for districts that have been selected for Tier 1 monitoring for federal programs under the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, or ESEA, which was reauthorized in 2015 as the Every Student Succeeds Act, or ESSA. The purpose of this presentation is to provide information on what must be submitted by Tier 1 districts, how to submit it, and when. Why accountability to federal requirements is important. The ultimate goal of monitoring is to support districts in the examination and refinement of their systems around federal programs. It is our goal to build relationships. The main objective of the Oregon Department of Education, or ODE, is to raise student achievement for all of Oregon's school-aged children. Through cooperative assessment of the federal programs between the state and Oregon school districts, the quality of services to students will be strengthened and improved. We also want to provide technical assistance. State monitoring team members provide technical assistance during the review and beyond. It is not the state's intent to tell the district how to run its title programs, but rather to answer questions, facilitate dialogue, and exchange ideas and information for program improvement, while, at the same time, meeting all federal requirements. And last of all, we want to ensure compliance. ESSA is a civil rights law that requires supports to students and fiscal responsibility. Monitoring federal programs helps ensure that all children have a fair, equal, and significant opportunity to obtain a high-quality education. Monitoring is intended to be a collaborative partnership between the ODE and districts to ensure compliance with ESSA. The ODE is in the process of examining its monitoring processes across the agency. For the 2024 through 2025 cycle, districts being monitored for formula grant programs, equitable services, foster care, and McKinney-Vento have been identified as either Tier 1, Tier 2, or Tier 3 districts. As I'm sure you've noticed, the submissions and participation needed changes based on the tier. A total of 58 districts have been selected for monitoring during the 2024 to 25 school year. The Department of Education requires districts to be monitored based on a risk assessment that examines the following categories. Student achievement, which includes in data on the percentage of students identified for comprehensive supports and interventions, CSI, and targeted supports and interventions, TSI, including the percentage of those schools that are Title I-A funded. Last monitoring cycle. The length of time since the district was last monitored impacts the likelihood of being selected. Unresolved findings. Districts who are still working on resolving concerns raised in previous monitoring cycles will receive additional support. District-specific metrics. The final category consists of data from smaller items that include total allocation of federal funds, percentage of funds carried over, timely submission of budget narrative applications, the percentage of Title I allocations set aside for district activities, individual district needs or requests, as well as other relevant factors. Data for these categories is compiled from a variety of agency resources. Statewide risk scores are analyzed and a determination is made as to the districts being monitored in the upcoming cycle. The number of districts monitored each year is based on risk level. Now that we have provided an overview of the monitoring process, we'll examine the requirements for Tier 1 monitoring. As described earlier, districts were selected for monitoring because they demonstrated some level of risk. Tier 1 is the lowest level in the 2024 to 25 monitoring process. Tier 1 districts should work with their district teams to complete the self-assessment. Each district will decide the appropriate staff to involve, but participants should include those who have the most knowledge of and responsibility for the programs included. Program specialists at ODE will review the district's submission and provide feedback in the spring. The purpose of the self-assessment is to help districts examine their practices around federal programs. It will also facilitate a shared understanding of the district's current practices relative to ESSA requirements. And finally, it will identify both strengths and where technical assistance or support may be needed. The district will not receive punitive action for any of their responses. The goal of the self-assessment is to help the ODE learn more about how to support and elevate district practices. The monitoring process for Tier 1 districts takes place between August and March. The key date for districts is December 2nd, which is the date by which the self-assessment must be submitted. We will now go over how to use the self-assessment Smartsheet. Our team considered several options for the self-assessment and ultimately settled on Smartsheet. We understand that some districts may be frustrated with the Smartsheet format, namely that you cannot save as you go. However, we felt that in this case, the benefits outweighed the challenges. First of all, this is a platform familiar to most districts. It will also better allow the ODE to track data, analyze responses, and provide personalized feedback. But most importantly, Smartsheets has the ability to customize the self-assessment to reflect only those programs for which districts receive funds. Therefore, the Smartsheet self-assessment will include only the sections relevant to each district. To assist districts, we have created a Word template of the self-assessment to use in discussions with the full team. We recommend that you fill out the Word template and then cut and paste your responses into the Smartsheet when you are ready to submit. There are 3 types of prompts on the self-assessment. In the rubric-style prompt, the district will self-evaluate a statement of practice by rating themselves as either 1, meaning emerging, indicating the district needs to develop or revise policies and practices in this area. 2, means developing, indicating the district has policies and practices aligned to some elements but still needs support. 3 is proficient, indicating the district has policies and practices aligned to all elements. And 4 is exceptional, indicating the district is so well aligned they could serve as a model. The second type of response is a narrative response. Here, districts briefly respond in writing to a question. Finally, there are some yes/no checkboxes. These prompts are a statement where the district indicates their participation with a yes or a no. These types of questions are only in the Equitable Services, Foster Care, and McKinney-Vento sections. After selecting a response, districts may be asked to contact the state program liaison to schedule a meeting. Again, a district's responses will not result in punitive action. Please be honest so that the ODE can effectively support you and your students. Let's look at what you'll see when you access the Smartsheet. First, you will want to select your district from the drop-down menu at the top. This will generate a list of programs for which you will answer prompts. The boxes must remain checked for a district to submit. So, even if you don't think you should answer the questions for a specific program, please leave the box checked and answer the questions anyway. You will also see there is a place for contact information. This is the person the ODE will contact, if needed, with any questions or clarifications. You will see as you scroll down the Smartsheet that each program area is labeled. The red asterisk means that a response is required for submission. You may choose to send me a copy of my responses by checking this box. and providing an email address. When you are ready, click Submit. All Oregon districts must address the challenges that students experiencing houselessness and students navigating foster care have faced in enrolling, attending, and succeeding in school, and to ensure that these students have access to the educational and related services they need to enable them to meet the same challenging state academic standards to which all students are held. Therefore, all districts, even districts that decline federal funds, must complete the prompts for foster care and McKinney-Vento. All districts that accept title funds must complete at least one self-assessment question about equitable services. This is to help the ODE and districts collaborate on determining what schools exist within the state, since private schools do not register with the ODE. Finally, one last reminder that the self-assessment must be submitted through Smartsheet by close of business on December 2nd. Do you have any questions? Please reach out. For formula grants and common compliance questions, call or email Jen, Sarah, Lisa, or Amy. For equitable services, please contact Jeanette. For foster care, please reach out to Marley. And for McKinney-Vento, please contact Lexi. Thank you for watching this training. Have a wonderful day.